we all think we're great communicators. So when someone else communicates like us, we're like, "Ah, they're a great communicator too. They're doing it right."
Brilliant.
Communication frequency is much more important often than the length of a communication. So if you and a friend text each other once a week, that can often lead to a much stronger relationship than if you have a 2-hour meeting once every couple months. The fact that you're communicating more frequently every week tends to create that familiarity, that trust more strongly. So frequency often ends up being more important in some cases than the length of a
Yeah.
situation.
Hi, Zandy. Okay, I have a pop quiz for everyone listening. All right, it's going to be true, false, right? So, if you have the choice between in person or an electronic medium, it's better to choose in person. Okay, true or false? What do you think? I mean, how about this? You can replace most meetings with email. I can certainly think of some. It's usually best to reply to emails as quickly as possible. How about this one? Typos aren't as big a deal in the world of voice texting, and people understand. How about be careful about overly using exclamation points and emojis in work messages. We all know that person. And how about this last one? Cameras should be on when using Zoom or Teams. Okay, so regardless of whether you're in the office 5 days a week or fully remote, much of our communication is over virtual mediums. And, the stakes are high. I'm convinced that if we learn to utilize virtual communication wisely, it can enhance your productivity, amplify your influence, forge deeper connections for you and your team. And I believe that strongly because I just finished reading Andrew Brodsky's new book entitled Ping: The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication. Do you want to know if you answered those questions correctly? Those pop quiz questions? Well, we'll talk about those and much more in this discussion. I can't wait to share it with you. A quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into our discussion with Andrew about his new book, Ping. Andrew, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I often hear people tell me that their area of research was in some ways some version of me search, right? Something about that, either something they struggled with or something that was important to them. And I'd love for you to share your story of how you began this interest in how people communicate.
Sure. So it happened quite a while ago. When I was 16 years old, I was diagnosed with a rare case of leukemia that actually required me to do radiation, chemotherapy, a bone marrow transplant. And with bone marrow transplant, I was in one of those bubble rooms where people could only come in if they were like fully masked, gowned, gloves, covered from head to toe. And even outside of that, I spent probably about a couple of years at home and not being able to go near many people because my immune system was so weakened by the treatment. So I got a very early experience of having to communicate with others from a distance. Basically, the COVID lockdown experience, I
Mm.
got a while before everyone else and to a much more extreme degree.
Exactly.
So for me, this is always an interesting topic. And then when I had the opportunity to begin studying this research as an undergrad and then as a PhD student at Harvard, to me, I was curious about, well, how can we do this better? And yielded some really interesting findings.
Yeah. I mean, it's and your book is just packed with them. It's just the evidence base, just to make sure our listeners are on the same page, because I think we could take virtual communication in different ways of what it means. So, how do you define it? And why are we all virtual communicators, even if we're not working remotely?
Virtual communication is any communication that you do via electronic means. So that could be email, instant messages, Slack messages, video calls. Now, telephone calls are also considered virtual
Hmm,
communication because
that's
we're all
interesting.
doing them through our smartphones and through voice over IP. So it's basically anything that's effectively not in person or sending a handwritten letter for the most part. And the main reason why I wanted to write this book right now is I've seen so many executives, media outlets arguing, is remote work good? Is remote work bad?
Mm,
And to me, they're missing the big picture here. Regardless of whether you work from home, the office, hybrid, anywhere in between, we're now all virtual communicators. The old way of interacting at work was anytime you had a question, you'd go to your coworker's cubicle or office and ask them. Now, even if you're 2 feet away from someone, you're just sending a quick Slack message or instant
Right.
message. And so we're all using these tools all the time, regardless of where you're working from. So for me, being able to provide some insight into the research about how this works, what mode we should use when, how we could do this better, it seemed like a good time for it.
Yeah. And I love how you don't have simple answers and it's a lot of it depends, but there's different scenarios, right? There's different situations. And whether we're working from home or we're in a remote office or we're 2 feet away from the other person, like you said, this stuff applies. And I really appreciate the framework that you offer in the book, referred to as the acronym PING. And we're not going to go through this because other interviews do that, and people can get the book to go through all the letters. I want people to get the copy of the book. But the P, which I think is worth the price of the book, is perspective taking. And, to understand what you mean, how about this? Can you think of a virtual communication that you initiated recently? And how did perspective taking, the P of Ping, guide what you did?
Thanks for the note about the book. But yeah, so the first part of the acronym is perspective taking.
Yeah.
So, first, the basis of this.
Mhm.
When we are communicating virtually, we become often a lot more self focused. Whereas in person, there's someone standing right in front of us. It's hard to forget they're there. We're very focused on how they're going to react. When we're interacting virtually, we're just staring at the text of an email on a screen. Or even during a video call, it's just a small square of the other person. So we end up becoming more self focused and we forget that there's someone else there. As an example of one from me recently, there was a situation where I was getting into I was working with a doctoral student, and it seemed like I'd sent a message that was pretty clear, good work, thanks.
Right.
And they didn't seem to take it so well. And I was having some trouble with it. So, what I did is I remembered some research basically highlighting the fact that we get very what's called egocentric over virtual communication, where this idea that we're focused on ourselves. And we tend to overestimate how clear our message is, and we assume people interpret it like us. In plain language, when we're writing an email or instant message, we hear the motion in our heads,
Mm.
but when someone else is reading it, they don't hear that emotion. So the recommendation from that research is you should try and read the message in the opposite tone if you intended. So if it's very favorable, read it as negative.
Mm.
If it's sarcastic, read it as serious. If it's serious, read it as sarcastic. And that's been shown to really reduce this. So I took myself out of my own shoes for a minute because I'm like, oh, this doctoral student's just too anxious. But I thought about like if I'm someone who's really lower power in this situation, and I just sent a 20-page paper and got a 3-word response, how might I take it? And I was like, oh, I kind of get where they're coming from here. Maybe I should have been a little bit more clear about how excited I was about their writing, or that I was going to give them a deeper response just once I had a chance to read it. But,
Yeah.
here's someone who took weeks coming up with something and they got just 3 words from me. And once I realized that, I was able to fix the situation and be like, oh, okay, I get what's going on here. And it's because my communication was somewhat ambiguous.
That's good, Andrew. That's a really good example. I'm thinking of like some people that when I get emails from them, it's 2 to 3 sentences max. And so, if I go to, hey, can you believe the weather and blah, 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 they're kind of like, get to your point. Right. And so it's just putting in many, I took it as kind of put yourselves in their shoes. Cause if you don't, you maybe won't have the appropriate empathy or you won't write it in a way or communicate in a way that they get it. It's oversimplifying, but that's part of the P, right?
Exactly. And that's also why we often write a ton of stuff in email or instant message that we send off that we would never say to someone in person.
Right.
Because if they were standing right in front of us, we'd realize how that would impact them and how negatively they would react. But
Yeah.
when we're behind a screen, we're not thinking about that as much. And we can often do things we end up regretting.
Yeah. I wouldn't say good morning, comma, Andrew.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I got to take that to heart even for in person stuff. But anyway, I guess a lot of people listening to us, that whole true false thing I did in the intro, would agree that in person communication is always better, right? It's got to be richer, but you can't read your book without realizing it's not simply that, right? So, why is it that in person isn't always better?
The quick answer to this one is if you have hours of wasted meetings every month or every week, you know for a fact that a whole lot of things should have been done by email or
Right.
instant message.
Right on.
I think where I see people often running into this issue is once they kind of begin questioning, should I actually be doing this in person? Should we actually have a video call or not? They sometimes overcorrect a little bit too much. So there's organizations like Shopify, for instance, that are trying to get rid of pretty much all of their meetings. They have like a meeting calculator. They randomly delete meetings off calendars if there's too many sometimes. And the issue is there's a whole lot of interactions that are also good to do synchronously via video or in person. It's like the conversation you and I are having.
Right.
It'll take us about an hour, maybe half hour. But if you had emailed me this, all the questions you're asking, and I'm talkative, so I'd spend maybe a few paragraphs, 5 paragraphs on each one. It would take me like days to write up. And like
Yeah.
that's a good example of like, hey, live is really much better for answering these kind of questions than typing it out. So it really depends on the situation, what's best.
I thought it was a very moving story in your book about how the doctor communicated to you the cancer word and how,
Mhm.
it's certainly hard to receive, but
Mhm.
how do you learn to give that? And let's say that it would have been virtual.
Yeah.
Like if you wouldn't even just mind kind of walking through like the advantages of not being face to face. It doesn't seem obvious, right? It seems like I'd much rather be there face to face. But do you mind mentioning that?
Yeah, it's really topical at the moment because they're talking about, for instance, for Medicare, getting rid of televisits for doctors.
Yeah,
So this is like something that's going on right now.
yeah,
And the beginning of the book, I start with the story of how I was diagnosed, the doctor telling me, but then I flip the story on its head and say, let's imagine someone hearing this virtually.
yeah,
And the thing is, there's pros and cons to it. People
right,
have a gut reaction, like you should never get a cancer diagnosis virtually. Like that needs to be told in person.
yeah,
But the thing is, there are just so many advantages often, or at least trade offs of doing it virtually. So,
right,
for something like a cancer diagnosis, it's nice if the family can be in their own home having to hear it. They have whatever they need for support there, as opposed to being in a sterile hospital or doctor's office, where they then have to walk out into the waiting room where they're surrounded by strangers
yeah,
and pay to check out and reschedule another appointment while this heavy burden is on top of you.
right,
So the idea here is that we should question our assumptions with those things. It's
yeah,
not necessarily that virtual is always better, that you should be doing virtual for those, but there's so many advantages we don't consider due to what I often call our in-person default, where we
mhm,
just assume that in-person is best, that we're not open to the benefits of other modes of communication.
yeah. It's one of my favorite parts of the book is how you give the give and take and the trade offs. And I think people listening to us can really relate to this. Oh man, Andrew, so many meetings and they're trying to think through even your comment about, well, maybe it could have been an email. So what are some of the factors that you recommend to decide is it a meeting or not? And that's kind of two state. Is there a third state there? Is like another option that you see trending that might be a good option there?
Yeah, so the two things are meeting or not, and the big
Yeah.
one people are asking now is cameras on or cameras off.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So for meeting or meeting not, there's a few questions, but the quick high level most important ones are, is there going to be a lot of back and forth?
Mhm.
And who needs to be here and how complex is it? Are the three things I generally recommend focusing on first. And things with lots of back and forth, you want to do those synchronously, real time, whether that's video or in person. Because when you've got an email chain or instant message, people often are hesitant to ask for clarification
Yeah.
because then they know they're going to have to wait a couple hours potentially or a day before they get a response, and that's going to slow everything down. And it's also weird to ask 10 follow-up questions all at once over email or instant message, whereas in person you say, okay, I have a few questions, let me just run through them. It just doesn't work the same. But when you're just relaying information, so it's just a presentation, that's often much better done via email. And then lastly, you want to think about who needs to be there or not. The research on meetings shows, especially for video meetings, the shorter they are and the fewer participants there are, the more engaging they are.
Mm.
So you tend to have more of that meeting fatigue when you've got more people in them, and then when they're just too long. So having fewer shorter meetings is better than having one really long meeting, is what that would suggest. And
Yeah.
then lastly, cameras on or cameras off.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the big question on that one, I'm always getting this one.
Right. For sure.
And this gets this idea of what is your goal in the situation. So if it's a new relationship and you're trying to build trust,
Mhm.
it's hard to trust someone you don't know that they look like. It's hard to trust someone if you don't know their mannerisms.
Mhm.
It's hard to trust someone if you don't even know what their voice sounds like. So providing all this information, we trust we're familiar with. And providing that information can make people help feel like they can trust you. And also cameras on, especially for showing engagement, can be beneficial because it provides at least the illusion that you're paying attention. It doesn't mean that you are, because
Right.
just because your camera's on doesn't mean you're not looking up a recipe for dinner or whatever else.
Yeah.
But it provides that illusion. That said, there's a lot of research now on Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue, showing that having cameras on, it's exhausting, it's fatiguing, it can be stressful. We're staring at ourselves, making sure that we look perfect and we don't have weird nonverbals or we don't have broccoli in our teeth.
Mm.
And that's tiring. So, in this case, if you have an established team, for instance, where you already trust each other, then maybe cameras off is better because it allows you to save energy and focus on the task at hand. Whereas if it's a new relationship and you're really trying to put your best foot forward and build trust, in those cases, you're probably going to want your camera on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think sometimes we're like, well, let's get together because it's team building and it helps. But you had a quote in the book. It was something along the lines of sometimes a 30-second text can build more team cohesion than a full hour of meeting time. And would you elaborate on what you meant when you were writing that? Because I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, the thing about meetings is they often feel heavily formalized. If you got a 20-person meeting, that's going to feel like for each employee, let's say you're a manager, for each employee in there, they're just going to feel like there's some anonymous participant in the meeting.
Mhm.
But if you just shoot that subordinate, assuming texting is normal between the two of you, I wouldn't recommend it in all cases necessarily. And
Right.
just doing it out of the blue when you've never texted them before
Right.
without some prior conversation is weird. But let's just say you do text. If you send them a quick text just saying, "Hey, I just want to check in, see how things are going. Is there anything I can do to, be of help?" Like just letting them know that you contacted them directly and in a more informal way can sometimes offer that support as opposed to just feeling like you're one of an anonymous body in a meeting.
Mhm. Yeah, I've seen that. I always wonder if that's just a guy thing, but I can. One of my best friends, I can just send him a quick 30-second or less text, and we feel connected. And so I think maybe that's a cultural thing now. I don't know.
And getting to that too is like communication frequency is much more important often than the length of a communication. So if you and a friend text each other once a week,
Mhm.
that can often lead to a much stronger relationship than if you have a 2-hour meeting once every couple months.
Yeah,
Right? Everyone would argue the 2-hour meeting is much more intensive, but the fact that you're communicating more frequently every week tends to create that familiarity, that trust more strongly. So frequency often ends up being more important in some cases than the length of a
yeah,
situation.
that's so interesting. That makes sense. Let's say an email just hits your inbox, and what do you personally take into consideration when you think through like how quickly you reply, and maybe lessons for the rest of us when it comes to timeliness?
Yeah, so there's this really interesting research on something called the email urgency bias.
Yeah.
And the idea behind this is that when we receive an email, especially after hours in work context, we assume the recipient wants a response a lot quicker than they do. So, and if you'd sent me an email, I'd be like, oh, he probably wants a response really quickly, important podcast host. But in reality, you probably don't feel the need for it that quick. You're like, "Oh, I'm busy. I get tons of emails. I'm interacting with potentially, 100 plus potential guests at any given time. So I don't care if he gets back to me for a couple weeks." And the problem is because we all overestimate how quickly, on average, people expect a response. We're constantly checking our phone all the time. We're attached to it, even during dinner time with our families, on vacation. So the takeaway here is that if you're going to be sending a response or you're going to be regularly interacting with people, it's good to make the implicit more explicit.
Mm.
Actually have some conversations about response expectations. So if you're in a team, have a conversation, say, okay, we'll respond to emails within a day. For instant messages or Slack messages, we'll respond within 2 hours. So if you're in a meeting or you're in focus time, that's fine. And if it's emergency during work or after hours, maybe it's a text, or maybe we'll put urgent in the tag of the subject line. That way, you benefit because now everyone's not rushing to respond every time they get something. You don't feel the need to constantly be checking your inbox because hey, if it's after hours or whatever, I'll hear the text chime. And on the other side of it too, it's nice because you don't feel like you're left on red, is what's kind of
Mhm.
often referred to now,
Yeah,
where
right.
you're like, did they read this? Are they ignoring me? Should I follow up? If you've already had those conversations in your team saying, hey, we'll respond to emails in a day, if they haven't responded in a day, it's not weird to follow up because it's
Mhm.
already been discussed. So you're not left with all this ambiguity and anxiety that's caused by that. On my side, I often will do a balance where, I'm ideally have an understanding with existing people I'm interacting with. But if
Yeah.
it's somebody new,
Mhm.
if for some reason I don't get to it as quickly as I might otherwise, I often try and provide a reason for it. So I say, for instance, I wanted to think about it for a little bit before I get back to you. or I was just checking my calendar because I had a couple floating things and I wanted to make sure nothing results in us need to reschedule. The reason why you give that little bit of extra information is you don't want the other person on the other side guessing,
Yeah.
because they may make the guess they don't care about me, or they're too busy, they don't
Mhm.
like me. When you give that other information, you remove the need for them to have to guess what's going on.
I kind of took from your book, and that's a great elaboration of it, that in some ways, what people want to know is, did you get it and when will you get back?
Yeah.
I find sometimes if I know I'm not going to get back for like 2 days, it might just be good just to ping them and just say, hey, real quick, just want to let you know I got the message, Andrew. I'm tied up, but I'll get back to you before the end of the weekend or something like that, right?
Yeah, and there's some awesome studies on leader communication,
Mm,
and what they show is that ideally, of course, you want to get the optimal amount of communication,
mhm.
but leaders who under communicate are rated worse than leaders who over communicate. So if
Just
you can't figure out what the ideal amount of communication is, it's better to err on the side of over communicating versus under communicating. Because you can imagine if you sent someone something really important and you didn't get a response, you're going to be wondering about it. You're going to have that anxiety. But if the leader says or manager says, thanks, got it, I'll get back to you by X, that removes all of that. And that lets them know, hey, they got it, they're paying attention, and they care. So sometimes just those few extra words can be really, really handy.
I had a coaching client, Andrew, who, it- because he had to commute into the city, I'm in Chicago, he would get up early, do email, go work out, and then show up to work more like 10 o'clock. And so he'd
Mhm.
end up sending emails like 4:30 in the morning. And he was doing it for his convenience, but it had an effect on his team that he wasn't expecting. And you kind of address that in the book as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, a simple fix of this is add something to your signature saying, I'm emailing at a time that works for me. I don't expect you to email me outside of normal work hours. And just setting that norm, you don't even need to have the conversations. You could just note it in your signature, can be useful. I've heard some managers intentionally use the delay send function in their messages.
Yeah.
So, for instance, they come up with a great idea at 9 p.m. on a Saturday, and they know that if they send that to their team, it's going to start creating the norm that everyone's expected to communicate on weekends.
Yeah.
And even if you say you don't really have to do that, it can still, people don't necessarily believe you. So, but they don't want to forget about it. So, what they do is
Hmm.
they say, okay, I'm going to delay send this email. You can preset in Outlook, Gmail, whatever,
Yeah.
so that it sends on Monday at 9 a.m. That way, you're not unintentionally creating that urgency in your team that can really create burnout, that can undermine performance because people are just so exhausted and so stressed because they don't get that ability to recover from work when they need to.
Yeah, it's a rare week I don't use that feature now for that very reason. And your book reinforces it really, really well. And I kind of joke a little bit about the true false thing with typos, but I do feel there's times with voice, when you do the voice to text, that people are a little bit more careless. I mean, we're trying to avoid them, but you talk about the impact of typos. So I'm curious if you'd just give us some of the evidence on that one, but also how do you personally try to avoid them in your virtual communication?
Mhm. Typos are an interesting topic. I did some research with Haley Blunden from American University on typos, and we had three findings from that set of studies. The first finding is kind of obvious: typos make you look less intelligent. No surprise there. The second finding was more interesting. That's that typos can also relay emotion.
Mm,
So it's not a specific emotion. It's like putting your fist up in the air. It doesn't
mm,
necessarily mean you're happy, angry, sad, but having your fist up in the air can make you seem angrier, or can make you seem more proud or more, excited. Typos we found in angry emails made the person seem angrier, and happy emails it made them seem happier. And the third finding was one where we showed that in the context of emotional messages, there's a decreased penalty for the sender in terms of perceived intelligence. And what that means is that if you send a typo in a neutral email, it's going to make you look meaningfully less intelligent in many cases. But if it's an emotional message, the person on the other side is saying, oh, the typo is because they're emotional. It's not
mm.
because they're less
That's interesting.
intelligent. And this matches other research that shows that when you have sent from my iPhone in your email signature, that actually decreases the penalty for typos. And when the person knows you're from a different country or culture, that'll decrease the penalty for grammar errors and typos because other people realize, hey, this person's English might not be their first language. And so that's why they have the typos. So the takeaway from this, though, is that the problem often with typos is that there's ambiguity behind them. And this is true of much of virtual communication, which is why I talk so much about filling in that ambiguity. But when people are on the receiving end of a typo, there's a few assumptions they tend to jump to. One, if they don't know the person, they're less
Mm.
intelligent.
Right.
But if they do know the person, it's like, well, they seem rushed. They don't really care about my message. And they don't care about me potentially as much, that they're just like literally just doing something on the fly and don't even care about it. And you generally don't want them to make that guess. So the way you could do it is by providing an alternative attribution, an alternative reason for the typo. So if you're doing a voice message and you know there might be a typo or something, you could say something like, I wanted to get back to you quickly. I'm on the go at the moment in my car, saying this out loud, and then kind of do that. And the idea that is there, you're filling it in. So instead of the negative assumption, it's like, oh, they thought I was so important. They wanted to get back to me really quickly in this case. So giving them the positive reason can be really beneficial for avoiding those problems.
Yeah. And that's kind of the eye of ping, isn't it? Like you're taking the initiative to kind of fill in the gaps, if I understood right from the book. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of I and N. So N is
Yeah. Right.
nonverbal. So it's
Yeah.
the
That's
kind of
right.
two of them
That's right.
together. Yeah.
I find that the tool Grammarly has saved my butt so many different times. Is there any tools you use to try to help you when it comes to the typos?
Yeah, so AI has been an interesting topic lately. Should we use it for communication? Should we not? I definitely use it myself for brainstorming and editing.
Mhm.
That said, I make sure to write my own words. The
Mhm.
reason being is if you're regularly just copying and pasting messages from AI into email, instant message, or using them as script during video calls,
Yeah.
you can run into a problem where the other person realizes you're using AI. And they may not realize it most of the time, but if they realize it once, maybe because it's using a word you don't normally use or whatever
Mm.
else, they're going to start questioning every interaction they've had with you.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem because then they're going to say, well, why didn't I just ask ChatGPT or Gemini or
Right.
Perplexity instead of talking to this person?
Yeah.
So I definitely use AI tools for helping to make sure that I don't make embarrassing mistakes or maybe just to think about some minor nuances of how I can brainstorm something better. But I do make sure the words are mine in my
Mhm.
important communication.
That makes sense. I feel, Andrew, like I'm doing more voice texting, not voiced to text,
Yeah.
but recording the voice and sending it as an audio message. I don't know if you're getting more
Voice
of those
notes.
or
Yeah.
sending more. I feel like I'm doing it more and getting more of those. Any research on that of the effectiveness of doing it that way?
Voice notes are an interesting topic. It's funny because if you were to ask most people who are, Gen Z at the moment, and you said
Yeah.
voicemail, they're like, horrible. I
Right.
hate voicemail.
Right.
If you ask about voice note, they'd be like, yeah, I do it all the
Love
time.
it.
Even though technically they're kind of the same thing, right? They're asynchronous, they're not real time audio messages, but
Yeah.
one just seems a lot cooler than the other. I
Mhm.
haven't seen a ton of research out on this yet,
Yeah.
but my view based on the existing research is that there are pros and cons to it, and it depends on the situation. So if you're trying to relay emotion, authenticity, that voice note can be really good because it lets your emotion authenticity shine through. Like, I really care about you. I'm really excited. You can hear it. And that mode itself is more effortful. So it shows I'm putting more effort into this communication.
Yeah.
That said, there's a whole bunch of situations that's a real pain for the recipient. So if I get a 5 minute voice note from someone, it takes me 5 minutes to listen to it. Whereas if
Mhm.
I gotten that in email, I probably could have read it in a minute, maybe. And if later on I need some piece of information that's in the middle of a voice note, it's annoying because I have to keep clicking around to try and start it at the right time. Whereas if it was on email or instant message, I can easily control F, find it and find the exact word I need almost immediately. So voice notes are a bit harder to reprocess or to kind of go back to on the other side. So for information, I generally recommend against them because it makes it a lot more painful for the other person. But if you're trying to show emotion, authenticity, something relational wise, that can be really handy for that.
Yeah. I like it. Okay, confession. I tend to use a lot of exclamation points, and I've questioned my use of them since I read your book. So, I mean, there's times where I don't overuse emojis, but I think we all know that person. So, what advice do you have? Because I know you've written a lot on this one. When is it effective, or how is it effective, or what are the risks associated with that?
Virtual communication, a big problem with it is that, especially for text based communication, on average, it comes off more negative than you intended. So, erring on the side of being a little more positive to kind of correct for that is a good thing in the first
Yeah,
place.
yeah,
But emojis, exclamation marks, that's often like I get a lot of topic questions from that from my students or like, should I put that? The CEO emailed me, like, should I send back a smiley face? And my answer to that is the research on this is mixed. Sometimes it makes you seem warmer, sometimes it makes you seem less confident. But there is one particularly good recommendation, and that's to engage in something called language mimicry. So what language mimicry is it's that you take your cues from the other person. So if they use emojis, you use emojis. If they use
Mm,
exclamation marks, you use them.
yeah.
If they use certain business jargon you use it too. If they use voice notes, consider using them too. The reason being is that we tend to trust people who are similar to us. So when someone communicates like us, we understand it. And we all think we're great communicators. So when someone else communicates like us, we're like, "Ah, they're a great communicator too. They're doing it right."
Brilliant.
The only note about all this is you don't want to overdo it.
Mm,
So if you're like copying everything they do, it gets real awkward. Or if it's like a situation where it'd be really inappropriate or counter-normative too, like so if you're CEO of an organization and you've got an intern here using a bunch of emojis, like you may not want to do that also.
mm.
But in situations where it's not weird and you're not doing it over the top, it can be really, really beneficial for building that kind of trust.
Yeah, I like it because face to face, we probably do more mimicry than we realize almost subconsciously. So in a sense, we're just trying to take the initiative to do that when we're doing virtual. Yeah.
There's
Hmm.
some older research that shows it's an evolutionary trait.
Mm.
So part of the way we show we're part of the same herd or we're related or affiliation is by copying nonverbals of others. And that kind of creates some of that cohesion that's been useful in the animal kingdom. So in person, it's actually been shown to be somewhat evolutionary.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, you say in the book that we can't rely on organic encounters of a hallway chat. So we have to bring the hallway into our virtual interactions, which I thought was a really good way of saying it. So can you think of any ways you do that either with your colleagues or with your students or relatives or how do you try to bring the hallway into virtual?
There are a few ways to do this. So, first, let me start with text based communication, email, instant message. One of the problems there is that there often isn't small talk. There's some studies in negotiation that show that in person negotiators have more trust and have better outcomes than text based negotiators. And they show that that's due to a lack of small talk that happens in text based communication. Small talk, although annoying, is one of the ways that builds trust because it helps us feel like we get to know the other person. Makes things a little more casual as opposed to competitive. But what they found is that when people had a 5-minute phone call in the text based negotiations, right before they started, just to schmooze or socialize and then negotiate over text, they did a whole lot better, both for themselves and also jointly in terms of their negotiation outcomes. So, being thoughtful about adding in a little bit of small talk can be useful for reminding the other person that, hey, there's a human on the other side of the screen. So sometimes in email, I might note something I did that weekend and ask them about how they're doing. Or if it's more casual over instant message or text, I might try and engage in a little bit of that back and forth. Not a ton, you don't want to have like 10 paragraphs of too much information going on at the beginning of your email, but a tiny
Yeah.
bit can be useful. And then the other thing is just being more thoughtful about having meetings where you relay useful information. So a problem people note about remote work is that you don't get a lot of that more implicit information from managers as they're kind of after meetings or whatever else is going on. But there's no reason that can't be done intentionally. Having short video catch ups with the people you work for, where you intentionally relay some of that information, can fill in those gaps. Just because it doesn't happen by accident doesn't mean it can't happen.
Yeah.
And when you're more intentional about it, it's actually better because the people who benefit by that casual small talk in the office, it doesn't happen equally.
Hmm.
So the introverts tend not to get that stuff as much. And managers like to engage in small talk and banter with people who are more like them.
Hmm.
So people who have more diverse opinions or come from different backgrounds are less likely to benefit from that in the office. So being more thoughtful about how you're relaying that information that people need can actually benefit people more equally across, and you can end up helping a lot more employees to improve their performance.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good advice. So many things we could talk about, Andrew, but let's end with this. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. So, can you think of some ideas from the book that parents could potentially use to kind of prepare their kids to be more effective virtual communicators?
Well, when it comes to parents, I'm going to bring it back to where we started the
Yeah.
conversation about perspective taking.
Mm.
It's even harder for younger people to get out of their own heads because they often have less experience with people with diverse opinions, diverse perspectives. And when they're communicating, they think what they're doing is fair, makes sense, is clear. And so there's less questioning of their assumptions. And one of the key takeaways of this book is to be more thoughtful about your approach as opposed to just going with the default and the norm. So actually trying to go through some communication that, for instance, you thought was really good to your kid. Maybe you sent them a text message that you thought was great.
Yeah.
And they thought it was really, really awkward and cringy. and actually having a conversation about, well, where did it get misinterpreted? And then saying, well, why don't we take one of yours and see where I misinterpreted it that? And then have that conversation, say, listen, we kind of are in our own heads with these things and we don't get it. So it's good for you to remember when you're texting other people that they're coming from a different place than you, even if they're your friends. And trying to make an effort to be more thoughtful about that can help make you a better communicator and can really improve your relationships.
Yeah. I have a good friend who he sent a text to his son. He's just thinking of during the day. He goes, "This." He said it was this meaningful, like pouring his heart out to his son, and all he got was a thumbs up. And he goes, "Wow, thumbs up." But that would be a point of conversation, perhaps. Of you probably didn't mean it this way, but this is how I took it. But I don't know. I just think that's kind of the world we live in, right?
Yeah, and I remember during my PhD, one of my advisors ended every email with a dot dot dot, so that ellipsis.
Yeah.
So I'd send him like a research paper or whatever else that I wrote and be like, "Good work, dot dot dot." And to me, it's like a doctor student. I'm like, "Oh, he hates it, like
Right.
dot dot dot." But then eventually I talked to him about it. He's like, "No, I just mean to be continued. I'm really excited about it. I want to indicate that like I want this conversation to keep going. That like I'm really liking where this is heading." And so sometimes just outright having that conversation can be one of the best things you can do.
I feel like for adults, doing this can help us stand out. And if we can help prepare our kids for it, it will really help them stand out. So
Mhm.
I feel like books like this could help us and our children, actually, for that matter. So for those listening, I mean, we've just barely, hardly scratched the surface on what you can learn in Andrew's book. If you're looking for evidence based insights on how to enhance productivity, amplify your influence, and forge deeper connections with your team and maybe family, get a copy of Andrew's book, Ping. Put links in the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us on the People
Thanks
and
for
Projects
having me on.
podcast. Special thanks to Andrew for joining us here on episode 457 of the People and Projects podcast. I think it's one of those things where we're so used to email, we're so used to texting, we're so used to Teams or Slack or whatever that we kind of just get used to the habits that we have. And I think one of the big benefits of Andrew's book is even just the first letter of ping. And so of the perspective taking. And a lot of that, as we talked a little bit about it in the interview, is just think about the other person. You're really putting yourself in their shoes. What level of detail would they want? What kind of information? How busy are they? The mimicry, of keeping that in mind. I thought that was kind of interesting. But taking the time to really think about the person on the other side. He had a quote that's something along the lines of, especially if it's an email that's going to go to a lot of people or some sort of message that's going to go to a lot of people, it's almost like we forget that it's an individual that's going to get this. How is that individual going to read it? So sometimes when it comes to requirements on projects, we talk about having personas and keep these personas in mind while we're developing the project. Well, it might not be a bad idea just to be, what are the personas of people that are going to be on the other end of this, and making sure we take them into consideration as we craft this communication. So I think it's an interesting idea. I'm personally a camera on guy with very few exceptions. Very few exceptions. I've not noticed in myself the Zoom fatigue, and maybe it's just because I spend so much time presenting virtually that I'm just kind of used to it. And the way I have my setup, I'm looking at my camera. I'm not looking at the screen necessarily where the other people are. So I guess I'm not looking at myself as often. But I just find if I don't have camera on, and I'm talking about me, I'm too tempted to go check out email or do some sort of multitasking. So that's the way I do it. And usually for our team, that when we're working together, we'll have cameras on as well. So part of it just comes down to what you want in your team. I have appreciation for what Andrew talks about in his book of it might depend a lot on the situation. I do feel like I've heard from a lot of people, especially people that are more into AI now, that they have less tolerance for typos because the tools make it so much easier to know, do you have a problem? So I noticed this I once a quarter or 1 quarter a year, I teach MBA classes at Loyola's Business School in Chicago. And I find that when I would grade papers, 5 or 6 years ago, I would maybe be a little bit more tolerant, a little bit. But now I feel like if somebody is not using the tools and they have just blatant, typos or, I'm not talking about subtle grammar things because sometimes English isn't their first language, but I'm telling you, I think there's less tolerance for this. So take advantage of the tools. And I mentioned in the discussion with Andrew that Grammarly is the tool that I use. It has helped in so many ways, but something you might want to check out. And then I just think overall, this is a call for more intentionality. Just take a step back, especially if this is a communication that's going to go to a wide audience or cross-functional or to people that you don't necessarily know. So it's maybe a little bit more formal, or they don't know you. And so, I have questioned some of my use of exclamation points. For example, I use them very generously. And so it's made me kind of think about, well, that probably works fine in most sort of situations, but in brand new situations where people don't know me or I don't know them, something to at least consider. If you pick up a copy of Ping, I'd love to hear what you take away from it. You can reach me at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com. And whether it's from the book or the discussion I had with Andrew today, I'd love to hear what connected with you. And if you'd like more on this topic, I put links in the show notes to episode 407. It's with Ben Gutman. He wrote a book called Simply Put. And it's not about virtual communication necessarily, but how do you craft, even design messages that are clear that people get across? I think there's a really nice carryover to today's discussion. Also, episode 332 with Kevin Eikenberry and Wayne Turmel. Their book very specifically in that episode 332, was about virtual teams and how do you connect and stay connected and operate well as virtual team members. Definitely check out episode 332. And then back in episode 237, it's with Dr. Nick Morgan. And we've had Nick on it 3 times now, but this is an episode, once again, about connecting with people in a virtual world. And I just think maybe you don't even have to read the book, but if you just listen to the interview, I think it'll just spur on some ideas that can help you and your team. And if you haven't left a review for the People and Projects podcast in a while, I'd love if you do it. You could do it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you consume your podcasts. Just takes a couple minutes, but every time you do it, it just lets the word get out to more and more people. And it's rare that I don't hear from somebody most days, but certainly a week doesn't go by without hearing from a listener. So if you haven't touched base with me for a while, send me a note at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com. I'd love to hear what you find helpful. If there's maybe a book or an author that you'd love to hear from. I get pitched 3, sometimes 4 or more times a day by publishers. So the vast majority are no's. But if I find something I think is really interesting that might be kind of a different from the typical sort of stuff you might get training on or input on, I like to bring that. But if you've got one, I would love to hear from you. Let me just say this on behalf of me and my team. Thank you so much for listening.